Who was Karl Marx? What did he believe? Are his beliefs still alive today in the form of critical race theory? Let's talk about it on this episode of Later Than You Think. Hello and welcome to the Later Than You Think podcast. My name is Jeff Sidarius. I'm your host, and today we are going to be talking about Christianity and Marxism, Part 2. In our last episode, we talked about Marxism and how it relates to traditional Christian teaching in the area of God and the theological heading of man. And we saw how Marxism basically attempts to replace God with man, to argue that man can save himself. So today we're going to expand on that, and we're going to look at what is the Marxist version, if you will, of sin, salvation, the eschaton, or the last things, the last times. And we're going to talk about ethics in Marxist thought. So let me start by reading you a quote from an essay and ask you to think about who might have written this. Quote, "Through our union with Christ, when we feel our total unworthiness and at the same time exult over our salvation, then only can we love God, who formerly appeared to us as an offended Lord, but is now a forgiving Father and a benevolent teacher," end quote. Now, you probably think that's something you might hear at a testimony. For example, a young person being baptized into the Christian faith. And that certainly is true. That is the kind of thing you would hear at a Christian church service of that kind. Actually, the author of that was a 17-year-old high school student named Karl Marx. Marx underwent a profound religious deconversion, if you will, shortly after that statement was written, and it was coincided with his entrance into higher education in Germany. The story of that, the account of that, has been well documented, but it shows that Marx underwent a profound experience. There is, you can pick this up in many ways, but it was only a few years later that Marx was saying things such as, "My object in life is to dethrone God and to destroy capitalism." So you can see what happened there, at least in some part. There is, I think also, it's fair to say, some evidence to suggest that Marx may have been even more deeply and darkly involved in things that Christians would consider to be off limits. Those are documented in a very interesting book written by Paul Kengor, who's a professor at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. The book is called "The Devil and Karl Marx: Communism's Long March of Death, Deception, and Infiltration." I will link to that in the show notes. I don't want to get into a discussion of Marx's spiritual condition, but suffice it to say, it was very dark. So that's a little bit about who Karl Marx was. What did he teach about what people would recognize as sin? Well, as you recall, Marx taught, pretty much in line with Rousseau and some of the other Enlightenment philosophers, that man was inherently good. Rousseau's famous statement comes to mind, "Man was born free, yet everywhere he is in chains." So Marx believed man was basically good. So if man is basically good, then what's the problem? Well, according to Marx, the problem that exists in the world, the main problem, is alienation from our true selves. Now, how does that happen? Well, according to Marx, it happens because of oppression and repression. It comes from outside. It's not, as the Christian Bible teaches, personal and internal. It's external. It comes from outside the person. Okay, so who's doing the oppressing? And Marx would say that powerful economic interests, which he called the bourgeoisie, capitalism, the ownership class, which controls all the means of production, deprives the workers, the proletariat, of the fruits of their labors, thus leading those workers to be in a state of oppression. And you will hear critical race theory people today talking a great deal about oppression, and in that regard, they owe a good deal of their line of thinking to Marx. So for Marx, the real problem, the problem that needs to be solved, is class conflict. Sin is no longer rebellion against God. Now it's pursuing individual self-interest rather than the collective good, and that leads to oppression. So as a practical matter, you could go to a worker, a member of the working class, and say, you know, you're being oppressed by the capitalists, the bourgeoisie. And the worker might say, huh? For Marx, this is no problem. The problem with that, he would say, is the worker has not yet developed class consciousness. In other words, he has not seen the light. He has not become aware of the fact that he is being systematically oppressed. So Marx is setting up a system deliberately to be a replacement for Christianity and other traditional religions that would essentially replace them or wipe them out. Okay, so if oppression and class conflict are the problem, the inherent original sin, if you will, then what's the answer? How can the working class be saved? The answer for Marx is very clear. And this is something that sometimes the Marxists or neo-Marxists try to obscure. But Marx himself had no misgivings about this. He believed that the answer, the way for the working class to be saved, if you will, was through bloody, violent revolution. The bourgeoisie, the ownership class, the capitalists must be overthrown, and all private property must be abolished. For the oppression to cease, according to Marx, all economic relationships had to be changed from the ground up. The proletariat, the working class, must be the ones to revolt. And there's the famous statement, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Marx believed this would happen at the right moment when capitalism was collapsing under its own internal contradictions. Marx wasn't very specific about that, and when that would occur, he just believed it would occur. Later on, Lenin came along and substituted party in place of proletariat in Marx's thinking, and he said, well, it's not enough, it's not going to happen on its own. There needs to be a party to move the revolution along, and he carried that out in the Soviet Union. The purpose of all this would be to set in motion, of course, a process of revolution that would result in a new system that would transcend capitalism and make it obsolete. Marx talked about socialism as really the first stage of that. As Winston Churchill famously said, socialism is only a whistle stop on the track to communism. And communism is the political embodiment of Marx's philosophy. Now, all of this to many people has really an undeniable attractiveness about it. I want to read you a quote from David Lyons, an essay he wrote called The Challenge of Marxism. I will link to it in the show notes. The essay quotes someone named Andrew Kirk, quote, "We can only marvel at the brilliant synthesis which Marx achieved between man's longing for personal significance and a worthwhile cause to live and sacrifice himself for, and his hope that science really does possess the key to unlock the enigma of man's contradictions and the power to provoke an unprecedented leap into a qualitatively new era." In this vision, if you will, which has very, very great appeal to many, many people, man is ultimately saved through creating his own redemption from his oppression in the life that he's leading under the thumb, if you will, of the bourgeoisie. And the result of all that will be the situation where it can be said, from each according to his ability. You've heard this, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. When that occurs, then we've reached the state in Marxist thought, or we will reach the state when the lion, so to speak, will lie down with the lamb, and good things will happen. The state will wither away, all private property will be owned collectively, all classes will disappear, and the revolution will bring about what he called the new socialist man. Lenin called it the new Soviet man, a totally new being who is essentially, to put it in Christian terms, redeemed. So that would be a short summary, of a very surface level summary of Marxist teaching that corresponds to the Christian theological headings of sin and salvation, and it leads very naturally, as you can see, into a discussion of the last things, or the eschaton. So when the state of affairs that I just described comes about, and there is perfect communism, the new socialist man is in control of all the fruits of his labors, then according to Marx, there will be heaven on earth, and human history will have progressed as far as it can go. He called it a moral progression from the darkness of class society to the light of communism. The class struggle is ultimately resolved at the end of history by the victory of the working class, and that is the last act, so to speak, in the play. So if we remember that God is not in the picture for Marx, there is no God. Man, it basically is taking the place of God. We can see that this is really what Christians would recognize as over-realized eschatology. In other words, it's saying that we can have heaven now. You know, whatever good life there is to be had, according to Marx, because there is no God and there is no heaven, it has to happen now. And the reason is because man is purely a creature of time and space. As one writer put it, and is quoted in an article called Marx's New Religion, 2019 article in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, and again, I will link to that in the show notes. Here is what happened and what Marx believed. In the same way as the return of the Messiah in Christian theology will put an end to history and establish a new heaven and a new earth, so the establishment of communism would put an end to human history. For Marx and other schools of communism, mankind, led by a vanguard of secular saints, will establish a secularized kingdom of heaven on earth. So once man is liberated to be his true self, and we know from Marx's teaching that man is inherently good, then how can their help be anything but a perfect utopia? Well, one major part of the answer is, of course, that Marx's view of human nature was horribly flawed, as history has proved over and over and over again. Here's one example. China, Chairman Mao, the Chinese Cultural Revolution from 1958 to 1962, it is reliably estimated that 45 million people were beaten, worked to death, or starved to death. The record is crystal clear and it's horrifying, but even more horrifying is when these things were put to Mao Zedong, here was his response. Let me read it to you. Quote, "If we were to add up all the landlords, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, and rightists, their number would reach 30 million. Of our total population of 600 million people, these 30 million are only 1 out of 20, only 5%. So what is there to be afraid of? We have so many people. We can afford to lose a few. What difference does it make?" The numbers are there. The numbers are horrific. Something on the order of 100 million people have died under governments aligned with Marxist thought in the 20th century. The Soviet Gulag system. Every American should read the book, The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn, who was a Christian, documented as no one else could do the horrors, the spiritual, the physical, the mental horrors of communism in Russia. Now, you should know that when these facts are pointed out to Marxists and their current counterparts, you will often hear people say, well, it's never been tried the right way. It's never been done exactly right. They just didn't do it right. And of course, that is ludicrous. It's not that a couple of people fumbled the ball somewhere. The horrors that have come from Marxist thought and communism are direct, natural outgrowths of what it teaches. Now, I promised you we would talk about ethics in Marxist thought. Let me read to you in this regard from a sermon that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached on September 30th, 1962 at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Highly recommended to you, and again, I'll link to it in the transcript of the sermon in the show notes. The sermon was entitled, "Can a Christian Be a Communist?" And here is what Dr. King had to say about why no Christian can be a communist, and he puts forth a very strong case for that. And one of the reasons is ethics. Quote, "A second reason that we cannot accept communism is that its methods are opposed to Christianity. Since for the communist there is no divine government and no absolute moral order, there are no fixed, immutable principles. So force, violence, murder, and lying are all justifiable means to bring about the millennial end." Lenin, the man who was something of the technician of communism, putting the philosophy of Karl Marx into practical action, said on one occasion, "We must be ready to employ trickery, deceit, and law-breaking, withholding and concealing truth." That the followers of Lenin have been willing to act upon these instructions is a matter of history. For communism, the end justifies the means. Close quote. I don't think it's possible to say it any better or more clearly than that. And this is something that I think most people who have perhaps not lived through the Cold War or have not had any contact with people who believe as Marxists believe, this is probably one of the most difficult things to understand. Here is where it gets personal for me. I practiced law in downtown Chicago for 34 years in private practice, and I regularly rubbed shoulders with other attorneys, judges oftentimes, various people who really were fundamentally and are fundamentally Marxist in their outlook. Here's the thing that is very difficult for some of us to understand. A Marxist may look like you. He or she may dress like you dress. He or she may talk like you talk, may use some of the same words, phrases, and tell the same kinds of stories and so forth. But let me tell you something. They do not think the same way you do. And nowhere does that show up more clearly than when it comes to anything ethical. Marxists do not care what they have to do in order to achieve their political ends. They will lie, they will cheat, they will steal, and they will do it in the open or below the radar, whichever they think will get them to where they want to go. But they just simply do not share the basic fundamental belief in honesty and truth-telling that you and I most likely do. Now, Dr. King, in his sermon, goes on to give more reasons why communism and Christianity are absolutely not compatible. He says, quote, I could never agree with communism as a philosophical system because it deprives man of freedom, end quote. Dr. King goes on, Karl Marx talks of that day when there will be a classless society. He says that while you are on the way to this classless society, the state is the end. Man becomes only a means to that end. And if any man's so-called rights or liberties stand in the way of that end, they are simply swept aside. And so in the communist system, you do not have freedom of the press. You do not have freedom of speech. You do not have freedom of assembly. All of these things are under the scrutiny of the state, which is manipulated through the party. And whatever the party says, that must be done. All of the freedoms that are dear to us are denied, end quote. Dr. King goes on to talk about and preach about how communism arose, at least in part, as a protest against what he calls the hardships of the underprivileged. He says that no one can deny that we need to be concerned about social justice. Karl Marx arouses our conscience at this point. He goes on to talk about Christians are bound to be in accord with this passionate concern for social justice. And I would just simply, and he quotes Jesus's words, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captive, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are bruised, and to proclaim the acceptable year of our Lord. So, says Dr. King, a passionate concern for social justice must be a concern of the Christian religion. And the only thing I would add to that, we will get to this in later episodes, but I would simply point out that what Dr. King clearly means to say by the term social justice in this sermon is not at all the same thing that critical race theorists and critical legal theorists mean by social justice today. The bottom line for Dr. King is expressed very clearly. He says, quote, we must try to understand communism. We must love communists, but never can we accept communism and be true Christians, close quote. So Marxism is basically an us against them mentality. It involves large amounts of envy, suspicion, rage in between, and all part of the class conflict between the workers and the capitalists. And one group is seen as being evil and essentially in need of being exterminated. Everyone's efforts must be directed towards winning this class struggle. Marx was not an armchair philosopher. He said the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is, he said, to change it. So Marx was, in effect, at least in his day, something of a community organizer. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of what Marxism is, what it's all about, how it relates to Christianity, and also perhaps you've heard some of the echoes of some things that you're here today in our current discussions about critical race theory and all of its many manifestations today. Next time, we will talk about what happened to Marxism after Karl Marx died, which is important to understanding how it shows up today. And, Lord willing, we'll also talk about the two other main components of critical race theory, those being Gnosticism, which we mentioned earlier, and postmodernism. Until next time, please tune in to my Bible study podcast, which is called Digging for Diamonds. It's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, as is this Later Than You Think podcast. You can provide me with feedback, questions, comments, and so forth. Email me at diggingfordiamonds99@gmail.com. That's diggingfordiamonds99@gmail.com. Thank you for listening today. It's important for all of us to get a grasp on these things because the current condition of wokeism and critical race theory and what it's doing in our culture today are such that we need to know these things because it is, in fact, later than you think.